Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Brandon Rood, Abert Family Curator of American Art at the Milwaukee Art Museum and co-curator of the exhibition Americans in Spain, Painting and Travel, 1820 to 1920. I want to thank everyone for attending this evening's program in conjunction with the exhibition, and I want to offer my sincerest thanks to the exhibition sponsors. The exhibition is made possible in part by a major grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities and from the Henry Luce Foundation, the national presenting sponsor. Our supporting sponsors include the Wyeth Foundation for American Art, the Milwaukee Art Museum's American Art Society, and the Tourist Office of Spain in Chicago. And our contributing sponsors are Christie's and the Gladys Griebel Delmas Foundation. I want to extend a special thanks to the American Art Society for their support in making possible this evening's program, as well as the exhibition's educational programming. And I hope that you'll join us for our next program in this series on September 9th at 6:15 p.m. with travel expert Rudy Maxa. Tonight's topic, Spain's Islamic heritage, is one integral to Spanish culture and history and how many 19th century tourists engaged with the country. A special interest to travelers for centuries as it is up to today. And we have an expert in Spanish culture and history to share with us how some of the artists and writers featured in the exhibition expressed their interest in Spain's Islamic culture as both fact and fantasy. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Eugenia Afinoguénova. Dr. Afinoguénova is professor and chair of the Department of Languages, Literatures, and Cultures at Marquette University, where she has taught numerous courses on Hispanic cultural studies since 1999. She's the author and editor of several books and essays on the subject, including the award-winning The Prado, Spanish Culture and Leisure, 1819 to 1939, looking at Picasso's Guernica after the Catalan Revolution, the transgressive left and the end of history from the Journal of Spanish Cultural Studies, and Spain is Still Different, Tourism and Discourse in Spanish Identity. I am thrilled to have Eugenia join us this evening. She has been an integral part of this project as a trusted advisor, a contributor to the exhibition and catalog, and the lead director on two of the exhibition's digital initiatives, the Artist Travelers Project and the app and bilingual audio that accompanied it. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Eugenia Afinoguénova.
Thank you so much, Brandon. I hope everybody can hear me. I'm thrilled to be here. And before I continue, I would like to thank Brandon Rood and Corey Piper, the co-curators of Americans in Spain, Painting and Travel, as well as Milwaukee Art Museum's extraordinary team, especially China Bounds, Dustin Dupree, and Rachel Steinbring, for the opportunity to collaborate around the Americans in Spain exhibition. My goal for the next 45 minutes is to provide a context for the sections of the exhibition. Oops, sorry, I have a complicated system here. For the section of the exhibitions that depict Spain's Islamic heritage. I would start with some terminology. Scholars define heritage as memories, artifacts, ideas, and cultural practices that communities choose from the past in response to their present needs. Since history cannot be directly experienced or touched, heritage is used to substantiate any historical claim. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, as France, Britain, Russia, and Spain were waging colonial wars on the fringes of the Ottoman Empire, with the United States acting as an eager participant first and an interested onlooker later, the paintings, photographs, sketches, and travelogues featured in the exhibition inscribed Spain's Muslim heritage into the story that the French writer and statesman Victor Hugo imagined is the march of civilization against barbarism. What exactly Islamic Spain represented was an open question, however. Was it a civilization that perished due to some schism of the soul, as the American historian William Toynbee would argue in the 1930s? Or was it, on the contrary, just a page in Christianity's centennial war against the enemy that the French now racialized as Arab, as reflected on this historical atlas right here, that gave to some cities and rivers Arabic names, yet divided the whole land into Christian or under Arabs, as if describing a territory without a state. Or here is another map, this one, of the next 2 centuries, which marks the territories of the Almoravid and Almohad empires of the Iberian Peninsula as the Kingdom of Morocco. Washington Irving, the earliest and still one of the most influential North American writers about Spain, described the country as partaking of the savage and solitary character of Africa, just contributing to the connection with a neighboring continent. I absolutely love this beautiful cover, and there we see a more or less recognizable element from the Alhambra Palace, but everything that you see through the arch is fictional, or maybe coming from the other side of the Strait of the Gibraltar. From the United States, things look even more complex than from Europe, since 19th century Protestants viewed both Islam and Catholicism as 2 wrong religions, as art historian Betsy Boone and other scholars write. This, for example, is an atlas that shows that United States Congress was monitoring religious transformations through time across the globe. Still, in this enlargement, you see that somehow it showed Spain switch from Islam to Catholicism in the 10th century, 500 years before the surrender of Granada to Ferdinand and Isabella, the Catholic kings. By the 20th century, however, the Masonic and other brotherhood organizations began to exalt an imaginary East as a source of true knowledge. Some of you will probably recognize this example of Oriental fantasy, the Shriners' Temple in Milwaukee. Spain's inclusion into Christendom, the Christian world, was a late event. In 1916, the users of this historical atlas were reminded that until mid-11th century, Islam stretched as far north as the Ebro River and featured the city of Saragossa as a border town. Many European nations rushed to complete their empires in the 19th century, coincided with the independence of Spain's colonies in Latin America in the wake of Napoleon's occupation of Spain in 1808 to 1814. Hence, the colonization of Africa caused inside Spain a discussion around reorienting the country's search for its historical mission. In her book, Disorientations, literary scholar Susan Martin Marquez plays on the notion of Orientalism developed by Edward Said, a prominent expert on colonial language and imagery. Said defined Orientalism as a system of knowledge and representation about India, the Middle East, and North Africa that supported British and French colonial powers. As Martin Marquez shows, in Spain, the surging global debate about the future of Africa provoked a whole range of responses, both Orientalist and disorienting. Following the expansion of biological racism, some Spanish intellectuals declared North Africans their brothers in blood in decline, in need of being invigorated by an invasion from their northern neighbor. Others agreed that there was a brotherhood of blood between Spaniards and North Africans, yet insisted that both were white. Meanwhile, the liberal Spaniards that had supported Napoleon's invasion and were sent to exile after his defeat styled themselves as modern Moriscos, the Christianized descendants of the medieval Iberian Muslims who were expelled from the peninsula in the early 17th century. Currently, we refer to the succession of the states under Arab and Muslim rule in the Iberian Peninsula using the blanket term of Al-Andalus. In reality, this almost 9-year-old long history began in 711 as the Kingdom of Cordova under the control of the Umayyad base in North Africa. It became an independent Cordova Emirate in 700, no, sorry. No, it's not working this way. My apologies. In 756 and morphed into a Cordova Caliphate in 929. The conflicts between the descendants of the first wave of conquest and the expanding group of peninsula-born rich, who were not a part of the old tribal elites and even included freed slaves of European origin, led to the dismantlement of the caliphate in the year 1031 into dozens of states called the taifas. I have a different map that somehow does not, okay. My apologies, something happened to some of these maps. I have a map that shows every taifa with the name of emirate. Exhausted by border wars with the neighboring Christian states, the Taifas rulers would invite the help from North Africa, where a new Almoravid empire had been created, until they themselves were conquered and became a part of that empire, thus putting the end to the independent Al-Andalus. When the Almoravid empire was absorbed into a new Almohad empire, Al-Andalus remained one of its parts, and when that empire ceased to exist, another brief period of taifas followed. In the 19th century, as the colonial agenda was channeled back into North African history, the example of the militaristic Almoravids and Almohads was using as a cautioning tale, justifying the need for civilizing intervention. In 1880, finally, capturing the Great Mosque of Cordova, yet calling it a mosque at Cordova, as if there were more than one such grand buildings in the city, Irvin Lord Weeks, an expat American artist, channeled both the admiration for this culture and the fear of it. Here is how the piece was described in 1905 in the posthumous catalogue of Weeks' work. I quote, "Preaching the holy war against the Christian, the old Moor holds aloft the green bag of Muhammad while he curses the dogs of Christians with true religious fervor and calls on Muhammad to drive them out of Spain," end of quote. This painting, however, is a good example of what art historian Mark Gottlieb called the Orientalist sublime, and the examination of horrific intuitions surpassing the human imagination placed against the backgrounds captured with such clarity that it surpassed the capacity of the human eye to see. This photo of mine, this one, captures the limits of what one can actually see at the Mosque of Cordova, and also allows us to notice the liberties that the artist took, expanding the naves, removing the railing, and using the rag and the lamp from other parts of the Muslim world. In the 16th century, a Renaissance cathedral was built in the middle of the mosque to confirm the fullness of the Christian rule over the city and the peninsula. The monument is now called Mosque Cathedral of Cordova. In 2016, a group of Muslims was arrested by the Spanish police for trying to pray there. Cordova surrendered to the Christian kingdom of Castile and Leon in 1238, and 10 years later, the conquest of Seville marked the end of the Almohad Empire on the peninsula. Until the fall of Granada in 1492, the majority of the peninsula was Christian, with only the Nasrid kingdom of Granada remaining. The walls of the Alhambra still feature the coat of arms of the Nasrid dynasty, stating, "No one victorious but the Allah." There are legends and medieval poems in Spain about Boabdil, the last king of Granada, who cried, taking in the last view of the Alhambra after he gave the keys to Ferdinand and Isabella. We can understand how the breathtaking views, so popular among 19th and early 20th century visitors, could become even more emotional if we assumed Boabdil's point of view. John Ferguson Ware was not an Orientalist, and he even expressed his dislike for the Alhambra. Still, the frame that reproduced the Nasrid plaster calligraphy with the words "No God except the Allah" and "God is the Lord of the universe" brings the painting into the Orientalist fold. Much ink has been spilled over the extent and the limits of the so-called convivencia, a peaceful coexistence between the three people of the book, or Ahl al-Zimma in Arabic, meaning Muslims, Christians, and Jews in the medieval Iberia. We have to remember that territories changed hands very often, and that Muslim and Christian rulers alternated, fighting each other with fighting against common enemies. In Muslim and Christian territories alike, the members of the two religious communities not in power enjoyed the ruler's official protection, which, however, also included unequal taxation, legal oversight of mixed marriages and religious conversions, and prohibition to dress as representatives of other religions. In the Christian lands, protected status did not protect Jews against persecutions or pogroms. In the Muslim territories, slavery was allowed, and it included white European prisoners of war. In the Christian territories, Muslims and Jews could not be Christian superiors and had special procedures for giving oaths. Muslims had to be taken to a mosque and Jews to a synagogue. In the Muslim-dominated lands, legal scholars debated whether Muslims had to accept Christians' invitations to share a meal or could wear clothing made by Christians and Jews. Law historian Raja Sakrani writes about the Iberian Muslims' ability to treat the Ahl al-Zimma both as an inferior, being subject to Islamic domination, and at the same time as an extension of the self, as an integral part of the Ummah. Following the initial conquest, the words Muslim and Arab were synonymous, as one could only become a Muslim by joining a tribe as an adopted member, a mawali, a word that eventually came to denote Muslims of non-Arabic origin or freed slaves. Arabs were a minority in Al-Andalus. In Christian lands, the word to refer to Andalusian non-converted Muslims was Moro, a word that I tell my students to never use, since at present it is considered derogatory. In the Middle Ages, the word indicated religious, cultural, or racial difference, separately or together. We may remember Shakespeare, Othello, the Venetian War. The rise of the so-called scientific racism in the 18th and 19th centuries turned the word into a negative racial label in both English and Spanish. After the 1830s, as France began a series of wars that would eventually lead to the incorporation of the Turkish Algiers into the French metropolis and the establishment of the French protectorates in Morocco and Tunisia, with Britain's attempts to detain its advances and Spain's efforts to protect its outposts of Ceuta and Melilla near Morocco, a new racist language began to emerge. North Africans were divided into Arabs, that the French typified as dark-skinned Oriental Semites and Muslim warriors, and Berbers, racialized as no dark original inhabitants of Northern Africa with the potential to become subjects of the French Empire, as historian Ramzi Rouihi writes. In the colonial lexicon, the word Moor became a synonym of Arab and thus absorbed the derogatory racist connotations. I have to apologize for using it when I cite the writings of the 19th century travelers. We usually associate the 1492 conquest of Granada, the last Muslim state on the peninsula, with the expulsion of the Jews. Yet initially, the treatment of Jews and Muslims was different. In regard to the former, in the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon, a politics of conversion was taking place since before the conquest of Granada. High social position that some Christian Jews called conversos enjoyed led to pogroms and persecution by the Inquisition, which claimed that in secret the conversos were practicing Judaism. For the time being, however, No attempts were made to convert the Muslims, whose well-being served as a guarantee for the Christian rulers' good relations with their Muslim neighbors. This is what the conquest of Granada would change. In Castile, the kingdom of Isabel, the Catholic queen, the decision about the Muslims' conversion was quick and similar to what was applied to the Jews. In Ferdinand's, her husband's kingdom of Aragon, the recognition of the Muslims' freedom of cult lasted until 1355. This is why some of the best and the most numerous samples of the Mudéjar architecture, the churches and public buildings constructed by the Muslims in Christian territories, can be found in present-day Aragon, Catalonia, and Navarra. Soon, however, the numbers of Christian Muslims called Moriscos far surpassed those of the Jewish conversos before their forced exile in the previous century. Moriscos were Christians who retained some of their ancestors' cultural practices, such as the use of the Arabic clothing and language or prohibition to eat pork. They lived in closely knit, isolated communities, and the exact degree of their Christianization was hard to know. Those who persecuted the Moriscos considered habits such as eating meals seated the Arabic way on the floor as a proof of the whole family's secret practicing of Islam. Until recently, Moriscos were characterized as illiterate or uncultured. But new studies of the so-called Alhamiado literature, which are texts in Castilian Spanish written in an Arabic script, show considerable intellectual efforts on the part of the Morisco intellectuals to question the limits of both religions. In 1522, the grandson of the Catholic monarchs, Emperor Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, who was also King Charles I of Spain, petitioned to the Pope to revoke the royal promise to protect the Muslims' religious freedoms that his grandfather had given. Since the Ottoman Turks were already challenging Spain's hegemony in the Western Mediterranean, the Moriscos were reframed as the Turks' hidden supporters. A century later, between 1609 and 1613, they were sent into exile. In the second volume of Don Quixote de la Mancha, Miguel de Cervantes, the famous Spanish writer who had been a slave in Algiers, included heartbreaking pages dedicated to a story of an exiled Morisco. Ricote, Sancho Panza's former neighbor, could find no land to take him in until he reached Germany. The expulsion of the Moriscos is now considered the first refugee crisis in the Mediterranean. Given the colonial context behind the 19th century surge in interest towards Spain, it is ironic yet important to remember the Ottoman Empire, whose progress in the 17th century brought the Muslims' presence on the peninsula to a tragic end, only to bring back artists and travelers eager to see Muslim art 2 centuries later, once this empire began to disintegrate. Those travelers felt the pressure of distinguishing between the inhabitants of present-day Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco, and the medieval Andalusians. At other times, however, especially in the earlier 19th century, travel writers intentionally blurred these differences using the blanket word Moor for both the North Africans and the creators of Spain's Islamic heritage. The resulting image of Spain was anachronistic as well as dystopian, a place still removed from Christendom and submerged into an eternal past. In this book, Travels in England, France, Spain, and the Barbary States, the New York diplomat and playwright Mordecai Manuel Noah described Jerez de la Frontera, the flourishing British-dominated center of Spain's sherry industry, as if the medieval Muslims had never left. And I quote, "A number of narrow streets and low houses in a part of the town seemed to indicate its Moorish origin. A gate near the Posada, where I lodged, bore an inscription in Arabic, and a Moor with naked feet and slippers sat under it, composedly smoking a pipe and selling dates, oranges, shawls, and essences." End of quote. Having been not long before appointed United States consul in Tunisia, Noah was traveling in the company of 2 other Americans, one of them rescued from bondage, and a Tunisian guide whom he called a Moor. Back at home, Noah was known for his racist ideas and support for slavery. In Spain, he was watching his Tunisian guide's reaction to the relics of the Muslim rule and concluded, I quote, "How strong the attachment of the Moors must be to those towns in Spain which have witnessed the triumph of their arms. The sensations of an intelligent Moor on visiting Cordova may be easily imagined." End of quote. Despite the centuries that separated the travelers from Al-Andalus, for Noah, Jerez de la Frontera was like a war camp recently abandoned by the enemy. As to the Christian challengers in the peninsula, the British and North American authors often identified them as Goths, reflecting the rising myth of Aryan supremacy. This description added to the Muslim-Christian confrontation and coexistence an air of a fantasy story about the disintegration of both the Roman and the Ottoman empires, while also putting a big question mark as to who the real barbarians now were. In this book, The Pillars of Hercules, David Urquhart, a British diplomat and supporter of Turkey against Russia, leaves a confusing descriptions of Spanish history in which the Goths, as he calls them, figure as invaders who, together with the so-called Saracens, meaning Muslims, yet much less successfully, contributed to the destruction of the native population, whom the author identifies as Iberians. I quote, "The Goths were originally but an army that entered Spain to protect its inhabitants. When Spain afterwards recovered herself from Saracens, she was altogether Gothic, with no trace of the old population, except in the Basque provinces, where neither the Goths had penetrated before, nor did the Saracens after. The remainder of the original, that is the Iberian population, had therefore become Mussulmans." End of quote. To such travelers, the very presence of the Islamic monuments, let alone their quality, testified to the moral victory of Al-Andalus despite the territorial outcome of their rules. Kate Field, who traveled to Spain in 1873 to record for the New York Tribune an interview with Emilio Castelar, the president of Spain's First Republic, repeated the then popular trope of the Gothic origin of the Gothic architecture. Remembering Madame de Stael's definition of architecture as frozen music, Field writes, "Chopin's dreamiest nocturnes and reveries came into my head, and then harmony would be disturbed by the contact with great Gothic pillars and portals. Thus it happened that all through the town, my nerves were shocked by discords, Goth and Jew rudely jostling the Moor, who alone preserved the dignity of repose, as if conscious of superior art." End of quote. It is kind of endearing that Field put the Goths back into the Gothic architecture, having, as she writes, been presented with a monograph entitled Toledo en la mano, meaning Toledo in your hand, in 2 volumes of 1,550 pages, this one. Even the title is extremely long. And then Field writes, "After this handful, I gave up trying to know anything about Toledo." Matilda Betham Edwards, a British traveler, wrote this about Toledo. I quote, "The beautiful precept of cleanliness is not imposed on the Toledans as it was on the Moors, and everywhere one regrets it. The streets are filthy and so rugged that they make you lame in an hour, and yet there is so much to see that, lame or not, you must keep walking on." I love the Orientalist cover of Betham Edwards' book, especially the Japanese style of the front cover. Right, it's the Spain through the Sahara, somehow merge Japan. It is interesting that for many authors, the supposed triumph of the Germanic culture did not signal a cultural victory. Betham Edwards, who included in her narrative a conversation with an Algerian denouncing the colonizing attitudes of the French, used the Andalusian heritage to postulate the supremacy of Islam in medieval Spain. I quote, "If one were an intellectual being, why one would never wish to leave. But the material part of every poor person and every Protestant must make the thought of dying at Granada simply horrible. I never felt such a distaste for Catholic Spain and such a respect for Mohammedan Spain as here. The Moors made Granada the paradise we find it, and it was an evil hour for the civilized world when the enlightened rule came to an end." End of quote. Everything good in Granada is Moorish. It wasn't, end of quote, sorry. Everything good in Granada is Moorish. Instead of arts, philosophy, toleration, charity, and wealth came ignorance, the Inquisition, superstition, misery, and pauperism. European, now end of quote. European racist theories, it seemed, were failing in Spain. This painting by Robert Frederick Bloom might capture the traveler's disappointment with Toledo, a shabby provincial town in the former harbor of peaceful coexistence between the three religions, and the place of the famous medieval school, where in the 12th century, anything from the Quran to the ancient Greek esoteric science books were translated into medieval Spanish and Latin. And how did artists rise to the challenge of telling the story of Islamic Spain? Bringing North Africa closer to the Western imagination is usually associated with the Euro-American Orientalist art, 19th and early 20th century sensuous compositions featuring female subjects, or alternatively, the scenes of torture, murder, and religious fervor when the subjects were male. While in the European art, the East was typified as simultaneously seductive and threatening. In the United States, as Betsy Boone writes, Orientalist scenes of cruelty, often involving slaves, rang so close to home that such compositions did not emerge until after the Civil War. Meanwhile, seduction, the other Orientalist subject, clashed with American Puritanism. In the minds of Orientalist painters, many of whom were well-traveled, Spain was an essential stop and sometimes a pleasant surrogate for a danger-ridden Eastern journey. A French Orientalist, Henri Regnault, reached Spain in the mid-1860s before he got to Morocco. I quote, "The country is superb. It's Africa, it's Egypt," he wrote. Having visited the Alhambra, he felt that the march of civilization against barbarism was ill-directed. I quote, "Next to the artists who made that, we are barbarians, savages, monsters." That did not, however, detract Regnault from placing in the halls of the Alhambra the very cruel scene of execution without judgment under the Moorish kings of Granada. The artist indicated that the composition was painted in Tangier. William Merritt Chase's 1878 The Moorish Warrior features a similar combination of fear and attraction. A lover of Spain, Chase never traveled to North Africa, and this composition was painted for a German collector in Chase's Munich studio. Responding to the market demand for the imagery of exotic warriors, the artist placed in the center a racialized dark male testing the sharpness of his sword. This weapon usually epitomizes virility in paintings. The warrior's pose, however, as well as the accessories used to construct his identity, are a classic example of Orientalist feminization of the enemy. This warrior could be an odalisque, reposed and barefoot, with a pair of red slippers under the bed and a tambourine near at hand. Some of these objects are also featured in Chase's The Antiquarian Shop. You see especially the red throw, right? The exaltation of the Eastern crafts clashed with the painting's declared focus on masculinity in ways that once we begin noting sings them, point to the theatrical nature of the Orientalist aesthetics. The ideas of theatrical staging and dress play with even more complexity in the works of the Spanish Catalan artist Mariano, or Maria in Catalan, Fortuny. Having learned his craft from his grandfather, who made puppet theaters in the town of Reus, near Barcelona, at the age of 9, Fortuny already kept notebooks with sketches for costumes. Though he grew to become extraordinarily famous and would marry into the Madrazo family, a family of prominent courtiers, artists, and directors of the Prado Museum, the references to popular scenography are clearly present in his Death of the Abencerrajes. The composition is based on the same legend as Regnault's execution scenes that we saw earlier, but the treatment could not be more different. According to the legend, a member of the ruling Nasrid dynasty, in fact, Boabdil's father, invited the 30 members of the Abencerrajes clan to a feast, only to slaughter them on the way out. This is a faithful setting in the part of the Alhambra Palace, still called the Sala of the Abencerrajes, near the jet in which, according to the legend, water turned red from the victim's blood. The point of view, however, from a height and a distance that the layout of the space could not afford, allows the viewers to separate themselves from the events. We see no faces, and the decorations are only insinuated. The artist added improbable frescoes on the wall, the black ones on the left in the background. Due to the high point of view, art historian Susi Sofranco compared the composition with the perspective available on the bullfighting arenas and saw similarities with Manet's Dead Bullfighter. By establishing a dialogue with his predecessors, Fortuny complicates Orientalist stock imagery, turning the other into the self. Take a look at the Arab Fantasia, a piece whose very title seems to reflect the racial colonialist problematic. The hair, the complexion, the clothing, and even the movement of Fortuny's characters seem heavily othered, and it should come as no surprise that we are facing a purely self-contained world where no one establishes eye contact with the viewer. In 1859, Fortuny had received a commission from the city of Barcelona to produce a graphic report of Spain's war against the Moroccan Sultanate. He witnessed the battles of Samsa and Wadras and made multiple sketches, drawings, and paintings that were preparatory work for an enormous composition called the Battle of Tetuan for the Barcelona City Hall. Yet in 1866, he returned the money and left the piece unfinished, dedicating the following years to producing for the French dealer Adolphe Goupil etchings from the sketches he had made in Morocco. In the drawings, as well as those sketches, Fortuny showed great compassion for the Moroccans. His language of the Arab Fantasia is referencing El Greco's elongated figures suspended in the air, especially this figure with the hands raised in the turning half back, which is similar to the figures here. And also José de Ribera's Chiaroscuro. Please remember this image of the right. If the warriors in Arab Fantasia seem threatening, we may want to know that having returned from Morocco, Fortuny took this photograph for his carte de visite, posing as one of those warriors with a weapon behind his back, as in Ribera's Christ-like pose. Having enlisted as a volunteer in the same campaign, the Spanish writer Pedro Antonio de Alarcón was also wondering about the continuities between his own identity and his present enemies. And he wrote, Born at the foot of the Sierra Nevada, having spent my childhood in the ruins of Alcázares, mosques, and Alcazabas, and having caressed the dreams of adolescence to the sounds of songs of the Moors, inspired by their poetry, perhaps under the same roofs that shelters their last pleasures, it was natural that from my early years, I felt the calling of the nearby Africa, yet yearned to cross the Mediterranean to touch, so to speak, the incredible reality of the past on that continent. Foreigners from industrially developed lands would, of course, disagree with Alarcón, arguing that Spain, not Africa, was the place to touch the incredible reality of the past. Their attitudes gave birth to images that could be best described as realistic fantasies, where the shell of monuments observable in the traveler's own times harbored imaginary scenes from the past adapted to meet the expectations of the future. This is why I suggest paying attention to how time is captured in the seemingly humble, smaller size works exhibited in the rooms dedicated to the Islamic heritage at the Americans in Spain exhibit. Sargent's The Moorish Courtyard tells a compelling story of time as an architectural palimpsest. In the center of the composition, we see a horseshoe arch in the back, which could be either a door or a mihrab used by the Morisco owners. The door, however, is boarded, and a smaller asymmetrical entrance is put in its place. This is a well-known building in Granada called the Casa del Chapis. Yet on the numerous early photographs of the same space, the door and the window above appear usually open. Sargent's door, however, leads nowhere, firmly shut. The overlay of the Morisco and modern entryways promises no way out, and humble mules, not proud Arabian studs, occupy the space. Sorolla's 1909 Hall of the Ambassadors in the Alhambra uses a different approach to telling a story of time and about the importance and focusing on the importance of representation. While multiple existing captures of this place, including this image by the American photographer George First, seek a perfect symmetry between the building and its reflection, Sorolla angled his watercolor to assert the primacy of the reflection. It is blurry and leaves no place for the faint shape, looking like a human being in the part of the composition coded as real, well beyond. Even more interestingly, Sorolla's framing also casts a shadow of ambiguity over a part of the reality that is not a reflection, yet overlays it. The water jet that you could see as this strange greenish shape in the center left bottom part is the water jet, which the photographer carefully avoided. A good friend of mine said that Sorolla's representation reminded her of Taj Mahal, since the framing of the hall and the reflecting pond do not allow the viewer to sense the scale on the real building, which is quite small. The spatial as well as chronological scales are often lost when Al-Andalus is remembered or represented. I hope I have put Spain's Islamic heritage into a less simplistic perspective. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eugenia. And I know that China is inviting people to join the conversation with any questions that they may have for our speaker this evening. But to start things off, I will go ahead and ask a first question. And I was really struck during your presentation that by the terms fear and attraction. And that seems to sum up quite a bit. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that in terms of 19th century tourists to Spain. What, in your experience, your research, they found most fascinating or intriguing in terms of the features of Islamic Spain, that fear and or attraction, meaning the architecture, the legends, the history, or even the writing itself that you identified through the course of your presentation?
Thank you so much for this question. Yes, this is exactly what the travelers felt and what they wanted to express. And what they felt is something that we don't quite know. What we do know is the way they traveled. And usually, especially after the expansion of the railroad traffic in the mid 1860s, travels were quite safe. And Spain, for the British and French travelers, was not a faraway land. Yet the representations of Spain always portray it as a country that produces fear. It was very exotic, and it had to show a challenge to the point that the episodes of meeting with bandoleros, the pirates, right, or the robbers, were inscribed or invented as part of almost every travel narrative. There is a well-known story of Dumas, who wrote in his travel book about Alexander Dumas, right, the author of the Three Musketeers, who wrote in his book about traveling to Spain that he was extremely disappointed that he did not meet anybody who tried to rob him, to the point that he wrote to some well-known bandolero, sending him a note, a banknote, asking him to arrange a robbery for Dumas's companions, and that robber bandolero took the money and never arranged anything, thereby actually robbing Dumas. So, but in a very peaceful way. So all these, Spain was a nearby, safe, and not a very expensive destination that allowed people to travel, showing how brave they are, showing the challenge, especially this kind of, masculinized challenge of something that is attractive in a feminine way. But the travelers, when they were writing, felt themselves extremely brave. And all these exotic stories were then contributing to the success of their books, which in turn would bring them money. And as we know, travel books were very hot commodity on the 19th century book market.
Thank you very much for that. There's been a question submitted, so I'm going to turn to that and then maybe add to it a little bit, if I may. And the question from an anonymous attendee is, the term Moor encompasses who exactly? With a thank you in advance. And I know you kind of outlined the variations in the use of the term, especially in the 18th and into the 19th century, the representations or what it meant for different travelers, different people at different times. And layered onto that was a somewhat related question I had, and that is the relationship to North Africa. Many of these artists that you discussed, as well as many others represented in the exhibition, used Spain as a launching point or a bridge, if you will, to North Africa, kind of as you were just saying in the previous comment, dipping their toes in the water a little bit and then making that plunge, if you will. And in your experience, or again, in your research, do you think that this is often the case with many of these artists? And I'm happy to repeat any of that if you need me to. Thank you.
Oh, thanks for this question. So yes, again, and apologies, because I know if members of Muslim communities are here in the audience, it is a derogatory term, but I just did not have any options but to use it. And the thing with this term is this transition from medieval religious racism to modern biological or so-called scientific racism. So the term appeared actually existed since the Roman times, and used the inhabitants of Northern Africa, from what I understand. And then in the Middle Ages it was adapted to then point to any mix of cultural clothing or habits, religion or complexion. And it could be one or two or three or all the three together. So anything would mark you as a Moor. And then as the racism of this religion-based racism of the Middle Ages grew into modern biological racism, it became something of a racial slur that would merge with the same racialized usage of the word Arab, and would not point so much to a person's religion, but rather to the color of the skin and the possible social implications that racists associated with this color. So Spain was then a problem because the medieval rulers of the peninsula in Castilian Spanish were called Moros, and in English were called Moors. And so then when descriptions of Spanish monuments were coming into play, it was never very clear which Moors did they refer to. And this is why I found fascinating the analysis of the travel writing, to precisely find those complexities, find the moments when the two Moors, the racialized and dangerous inhabitants of so-called racialized and dangerous, yes, colonialized inhabitants of North Africa, were merging with the Moros that had ruled the Iberian Peninsula many centuries before that, how they merged or how they could be distinguished. So in a way, it was like a jumping at a bridge, which was geographical, but also conceptual, right? So it was a real challenge to test one's framework of understanding of reality, so to speak.
And then related to that, Randy submitted a question very similar to the one I asked at the very end, so it must be on the same wavelength here. Why did they go to Spain versus simply directly to North Africa?
Thanks for this. Yeah, well, again, that was less expensive. It was much more comfortable. It was not dangerous. And it offered a lot of modern comfort, and yet these gorgeous and superb views of the past. And yes, it was much safer than traveling to Northern Africa. And then there was also this idea that to understand the real history of the present day Maghreb, Northern Africa, one had to start with the history that involved the Iberian Peninsula, and that history could be still observed in the Iberian Peninsula. So again, it was travel through time and also through space.
And Joanne asks, what was the influence of Islamic philosophy and theology on Christian theology and philosophy? If that's, you can answer.
Oof, okay, so how long do we have? 3 more minutes? Okay, so I'm not going to say too much, and I only have, I have a partial view, not a complete view, since this is not my subject, but I could tell a few things. So it's a great question. We know, for instance, that Ramon Llull, which is a very important medieval philosopher, medieval early Renaissance philosopher from Mallorca, knew Arabic. So again, the Iberian Peninsula was a place where people would know both, or rather all the three. So they would know the medieval Romance languages, Arabic and Latin. And that was pretty unique for the time. So Lul, for example, knew firsthand, he had read some of the Arabic manuscripts, which affected some of his writings. I could also mention something that I did mention. So the School of Translators in Toledo was, as I said, was a place where El Quran was first translated to Latin via medieval Castilian. So there was a studies about how these translations were made. And apparently at the time, it was impossible or virtually impossible to find one person who knew both Arabic and Latin because they belonged to different church traditions. But medieval Castilian, medieval Spanish was a common language. So manuscripts were translated apparently from Arabic to Romance, medieval Castilian, and from that into Latin. And this way to Europe, a lot of both ancient Greek and Arabic and also Jewish thinkers, because people would also know Hebrew and medieval Castilian. So this text would then eventually enter the European canon. So I know I'm not completely answering your question, but this is something to just think about and some of the pearls there.
And a final question I have, as I've known you, we've worked on the project together, your contribution to the exhibition catalog and the various digital projects. So much of your scholarship and research is on mapping and cartography and on travel literature of the 19th century. Are there any of those that you discuss in the catalog essay that you have used throughout your scholarship or research that you presented or shared with us this evening that you consider to be less judgmental or perhaps more unbiased, or do you see them all as kind of layered with the history, the baggage, the perceptions and the prejudices of their time and of their particular age?
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you for this. So yeah, we've seen some atrocious maps, right? But on much better side was actually Spain's Arabism. So Spain had a school of Arabistic that emerged as part of the development in the 18th century of the academies of science and arts. And Spanish Arabists documented very well the Muslim antiquities and did the drawings and did the mappings that eventually reached, the French and emerged in these colonially transformed ways. So again, Susan Martin Marquez's book is amazing. I recommend it to everybody. It's called Disorientations, and it tells both redeeming things and much less redeeming ones about the development of science about the Islamic Spain in 18th and 19th and early 20th century Spain among the Spanish scholars. But yes, that project and the mapping in Spain was actually done by the different science and arts academies. So there was a large Coelho Atlas, for example, that is much more, much less ideologically marked.
And with that, we've pretty much reached our time. And so I will just end with a note from Susan, who said, thank you for a wonderful presentation. And I have to absolutely second that wholeheartedly. Thank you so much, Eugenia, for sharing your knowledge and research with us. This has been absolutely fantastic. And again, thank you all for attending this evening. And please join me in giving a warm thanks to Dr. Eugenia Afinoguénova, and have a great night, everybody.